The night settles over the old plantation house like a heavy breath, and in the dim corridors a whisper moves, soft as silk, yet sharp as a blade. They say the true rulers of these halls were not the men who signed the deeds or cracked the whips in the fields, but the women who watched from upper windows, their eyes carrying a power far quieter and far more dangerous. History remembers their lace dresses and teacups, their polite smiles and Sunday manners, but beneath those polished masks lived rules that bent lives and shaped destinies, rules no one dared challenge. For the enslaved people moving through these halls, survival depended not on strength, but on reading the slightest shift in her expression, the tension in her voice, the coldness buried in her silence. Her anger could change the course of a life. Her favor could just as easily disappear. No one outside these walls knew the weight of her gaze, yet everyone inside felt it like a hand around their throat. Every step, every gesture, every glance was measured, rehearsed, kept small enough not to offend, respectful enough not to invite suspicion. The plantation ran on her moods as much as the weather. A slammed door, a whispered argument with her husband, a visit from a neighbor that brought embarrassment. Any small spark could ignite a storm that fell only on the enslaved. The world outside imagined mistresses as gentle, fragile, powerless women trapped in gilded cages. But inside the house, their authority could be absolute. Dawn began with her commands, and dusk ended with her judgments. She decided who cooked, who cleaned, who served at the table, who slept near the kitchen hearth, who would be punished for mistakes or for things she only imagined. Even the master listened when she said someone had displeased her. Her power lived not in muscle but in expectation, reputation, and the unspoken understanding that her word carried more weight than any protest. The enslaved learned early that the most dangerous room in the house was the one she occupied. Because you never knew what version of her you would meet: the smiling lady who offered a gentle thank you, or the quiet observer who noticed a hesitation, a crooked collar, or a moment of weariness and turned it into accusation. Underneath her gentle facade lived a complex system of silent laws, rules never written down yet carved deeply into everyday life. No raising your voice, no turning your back too quickly, no slowing your step, no showing tiredness even when exhaustion pulled at your bones. Eyes lowered but not too low, responses quick but not too quick. A delicate balance that required constant calculation. A misplaced word could lead to cold meals, harder chores, or a sudden reassignment that separated you from someone you love. Many enslaved people later said they feared her more than the overseer because she carried a kind of quiet cruelty wrapped in politeness, the kind that left no marks yet cut the deepest. Behind closed doors, she shaped the rhythms of the household with decisions no one questioned. A dress torn by accident, a plate dropped in the rush of morning work, a child crying at the wrong time, such things became offenses in her eyes, proof of disrespect, grounds for punishment she claimed was necessary to preserve order. And in the evenings, when lantern light flickered across the walls and the house settled into an uneasy calm, she wrote in her private journals, listing grievances, noting behaviors, recording names. These entries often resurfaced weeks or months later as justifications for selling someone, dividing a family, or calling for discipline. To the outside world, she was a lady of refinement, but inside her notes lived the evidence of a rule built on fear. Even silence belonged to her. She created it, demanded it, enforced it. Voices were to remain soft, footsteps barely audible, emotions swallowed whole. For the enslaved, breaking that silence even unintentionally could provoke consequences no one dared risk. And so the house breathed in hushes, every sound measured, every movement rehearsed with the precision of a performance in which mistakes were unforgivable. Her control wasn't loud, it was woven into the walls themselves, into the fabric of daily life, subtle yet suffocating, an invisible chain wrapped around every soul within reach. Still, the deepest shadows of the house were not in its corners or stairwells, but in the places where her unspoken expectations pressed hardest against those who served beneath her. She controlled not just the work they performed, but the way they carried themselves, the expression on their faces, even the rhythm of their breathing when she entered a room. Every task became a test, every interaction a moment where fate could shift. One wrong glance could mean days of being denied rest. One misunderstood tone could lead to families being separated under the guise of maintaining order. Her power sank into their lives like roots, touching everything, leaving no space untouched. Many enslaved women later recalled how the mistress could smile at guests with radiant sweetness while dealing out quiet punishments that would leave hearts trembling. She wielded humiliation the way others wielded tools, with precision, with calculation, with an understanding that breaking a person's spirit didn't require raising her voice. A cutting remark in front of others, a deliberate lie told to her husband about disobedience, a sudden reassignment to harsher work, all these were the weapons she carried. And because they left no scars that could be seen, the world continued to believe she was gentle. But those who lived under her rule knew the truth. Cruelty did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Enslaved men felt her power too, often in ways they struggled to describe. She controlled their labor, their access to food, their contact with family, and sometimes even their very reputation. A single accusation from her could brand a man as dangerous or unreliable, altering the course of his life. Even innocence offered no protection. If she felt threatened, embarrassed, or insecure, she could redirect those emotions toward the nearest target, and the consequences were immediate. A man could find himself suddenly isolated, worked to exhaustion, or sent away to another plantation without warning. Her authority reached far beyond her delicate appearance, and the quiet terror she created lingered long after she left the room. Children were not spared from the weight of her expectations. Young enslaved boys and girls learned early to read her footsteps, her gestures, the tightening of her jaw. They became experts at predicting her moods, adjusting their behavior before danger arrived. Some grew up believing silence was safety, that shrinking themselves small was the only way to survive the storm she carried. Others learned to hide their tears, knowing she considered crying a sign of defiance. Childhood, for them, was not a season of innocence but a training ground in endurance. For the families trapped within that world, the mistress's decisions often shaped their entire fate. She might favor one child and ignore another, grant small privileges to one woman, while denying necessities to others, creating divisions that fractured relationships. She manipulated those bonds, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally, but always with consequences that spread far beyond her understanding. Enslaved families learned to fear emotional closeness, because anything precious could be taken away on a whim. And in those moments when she felt slighted or overshadowed, she sometimes demanded that someone be sold not out of necessity, but out of spite. The loss carved wounds that history still struggles to measure. Yet even as the years passed and the Civil War loomed, many of these women insisted on portraying themselves as powerless victims of circumstance. Their diaries painted portraits of burdened wives trapped in difficult lives, rarely acknowledging the devastation their choices created. Some described the enslaved people under their rule as family, never admitting that love cannot exist beside ownership. These writings became the sanitized record future generations studied, leaving out the brutality woven into their everyday indecisions. But the truth survived elsewhere in the testimonies spoken in quiet corners, in the stories passed down from generation to generation, in the voices of descendants who refused to let those memories fade. And when researchers finally opened the old trunks buried in attics, when they read the brittle letters and compared them to the surviving narratives of the enslaved, a disturbing picture emerged. These women were not mere bystanders to the cruelty of slavery. They were administrators, enforcers, architects of a system built on domination. They understood exactly what power they held, and they used it to shape their world in ways that protected their status, their comfort, and their fragile sense of superiority. In the end, the grand plantation homes grew quiet. The halls that once echoed with commands and controlled footsteps now stand empty, dust settling where fear once walked. But the memories remain. carried not by the walls, but by the descendants of those who endured. Their voices insist that the world understand the full truth that slavery was not maintained by masters alone, but by the mistresses who ruled through silence, suggestion, and the devastating force of unseen power. And in remembering them, we step into a deeper, more unsettling understanding of the past, where cruelty wore lace gloves and spoke in gentle tones, yet shaped lives with a grip far stronger than any chain.